Did you know that the cost of a top-of-the-line sewing machine can be the same as a new laptop? Many people do think that sewing is a very expensive hobby. And today, I am going to prove that wrong. As a sewing teacher that taught a lot of people how to sew, some of them total beginners who's never even touched a sewing machine, I've come to the conclusion that the following things are necessary for anyone who wants to sew. The first thing is a good sewing needle. Sewing needles depend on what you like. Some people like big ones, some like small ones. I find that a medium-sized sewing needle with quite a big hole is really effective. I like to use these. They are called, they're made in Malaysia, and I can't find their name. I think it's Prime. Prime makes them. But what I do like about it, if you buy a needle, make sure the end is really sharp. Also, make sure they are not too thick, because then you struggle to sew with them. So if you have a good needle, the next thing you need is a thimble. Thimbles are non-negotiable in my book. I do find them hard to work with, because sometimes as soon as I put them on the one finger, the next finger starts pushing the needle through. But it's something that is worth investing the time in learning how to sew with your thimble. Sewing machines are something that's also quite controversial. And to tell you the truth, to be able to sew, you do not need a sewing machine. Sewing machines makes it easier and faster, but they are not necessities. There are beautiful videos out there of hand sewing. I know Bernadette Banner has one of how to, all the different basic stitches to hand sew a whole garment. The biggest thing is use small running stitches, what I like to do, and every 5th or 6th stitch, I actually just do a back stitch, and then that seam will go nowhere. To finish it, you can do a French seam, or you can do a roll stitch with your needle. All of those stitches you can find online, and to start with, maybe do start with just doing it by hand, because there is such a satisfaction. But then, if you get to a place where you realize that you really love sewing, your next investment will be a sewing machine. Talking about the sewing machine, sometimes you have to lift the foot up and down, and it's the same motion that you will use to just press the like button or ring the notification bell or subscribe. And as my opening statement said, sewing machines can be extremely expensive, and it's not necessary. So one of the things that I would look at when I buy a machine is not to go for the latest and greatest. Often they are extremely expensive. But then also not to go for the cheapest one, because often the most cheapest ones have plastic parts on the inside. And the problem with that, as soon as you try to hem a pair of jeans, your whole alignment will go out. I love Bernina, but Bernina is so expensive. But if you can find an older one, their insides are total metal. This one was my granny's. She made clothes for people, so she was a seamstress. And then my mom used it, and then I used it for a few years. So this one have literally thousands of kilometers on it, on the engine already. And it still works beautifully. Some parts are a bit worn out, but it still works better than most machines that I've worked on. So go out and look on Facebook Marketplace, or maybe look on eBay and find yourself an older machine. I also have seen them at second-hand stores, and sometimes also older people who's giving up their sewing rooms. So keep your eyes peeled for something that pops up and that you can actually keep for the next 20 years and more. My next point is needles. Your sewing machine needles are very important. Some people come and say, oh, my machine is skipping stitches. It's the machine's fault. But 80% of the time, the problems that you are experiencing with your machine can be pulled back to the needles you are using. If you use the wrong needles for the wrong fabric, you have a problem. I will still make a video speaking about the different sizes of needles and the different types. But for now, what I want to say, if you have a thin fabric, use a thin needle. So my favorite is the Smidge Universal 6080. Now you get different ones. There's for stretch fabric and for this and for that, and they work very well. But I find that often it's just a gimmick to make money. So if you have a pair of needles specifically for jeans, and you have a 80-12, which is a bit thicker for the medium to thick fabrics, a 68, and then a 70-10, you sort it. You can basically work on every fabric that you want. And then I find for stretch fabric, which sometimes is a big problem, if you use Microtex, the thicker ones like 80, 12, or even thicker, you often are able to work on stretchy material without it skipping stitches. Also, when you are sewing stretchy materials, make your stitch length like medium length, anything from 2.5 to 3, and then pull your fabric, but not pull it through. Pull it like this and let the machine take it through, because that way your needle has time to actually get into the fabric and pick up the bottom bobbin. It makes a big difference. My next point of what you need as a beginner sewist is your little knipper. Now this, they're cheap, you can find them on Amazon and most other places, but without this, my life is horrible. I use it to cut my threads on my machine. I use it for doing the little knips when I do curved edges. And for unpicking, it is brilliant. Getting to the unpicking thing, you also need an unpicker. You do not need to get a fancy one like this. You get plain ones that's costing like $1 each. And as long as you have your unpicker, life is sorted. Unpickers are sometimes given a bad name, because a lot of people hate unpicking. I want you to think of unpicking as editing. So if you write an essay or a letter or even a blog, you're not going to post the first version that you wrote. You're going to edit it and take out some words, change some words, and then after maybe a few hours or after you've put it through ChatGPT, you might be happy and put it up. Now, when you sew, it's inevitable you are going to make mistakes. So, don't be afraid to use your unpicker. Your unpicker is your friend, and sometimes you need to use your friends. Coming back to friends, pins are your friends. I've had so many of my students through the years who's like, no, I'm not going to pin. It's not used. It's not worth it. It's irritation, or it's this, or it's that. Pins are your friends. Use them. And like my one friend said, sometimes your friends are pricks. Well, that actually applies to your pins. They do injure you through the process, and they are a bit of a pain, but it's worth every second that you invest in that garment to make it perfect. Now, coming to pins, that is one of the more expensive investments. You can buy the cheaper versions. I found this at, I think it was Joann's or Amazon, and they were not the cheapest ones I could find, but they were also not the most expensive. So I like the longer pins. These are 4 centimeters long, and the longer your pin, the easier it is to work with it. So I prefer the long pins. But as I said, the heads are plastic and they're quite thick. So I found these ones, which were much more expensive. They're glass heads and they are so thin, and they slide into your finger if you're not careful. And I think this was with the clover things. But sometimes, especially if you want to sew a lot, and it's when you start sewing with like slippery fabrics or chiffons or stuff like that, invest in some really thin long pins. But when you're just starting, don't buy the cheapest pins, because often you throw half of them away because they're blunt. But buy like mid-range pins that's longer, and this will last you for a long time until your skills improve where you need the better pins. Then, bobbins. I don't have the little box that came with this, so my extra bobbins is somewhere in a box in my parents' storage room. So a friend of mine heard my plight when I was sewing at her place. I'll put a link to that video, and she brought me some bobbins, and I can't tell you what an amazing thing it is to have extra bobbins to wind up cotton. There's nothing that frustrates you so much as when you're sewing and your bobbin has run out and you have to wind another bobbin. So when I sew, I always wind at least 2 bobbins. And also, then I sometimes end up with bobbins that still have the color on, and now I have to wind another bobbin, and then if you only have 1 or 2 bobbins, you're going to just wind it on the one that's already in existence, and then you end up having to pull off some cotton because your bobbin is full. Buy extra bobbins, it's worth it. Same thing of being worth it, let's talk about your cottons. So cottons, we have these dreams of having all the colors on this little cotton bobbin thingy on the wall or next to your machine, and it's pretty and everything, but it's not needed when you just start. These are the ones I travel with. It's the basic colors of cream and beige and white and brown and grey. And then a little bit of blue, because I love wearing blue, so for that reason I invested in blue and red. But look at what you like to sew and the colors you like to work with and invest in those. Get yourself some grey, because grey is so versatile. As soon as you have a fabric with a muddy undertone, like this blue is a bit of a muddy undertone, and I have a brown with a muddy undertone, you can put grey on that and you will not see it. Also cream, because sometimes when you work with some fabrics, if the cotton is too white, it does show. So if you have white, cream, black and grey to start with, you are sorted for cottons, and you can bring in the other colors as you go along. Because a lot of people go out and get all the colors and then it costs them a fortune. The next thing is scissors. You need a good pair of scissors. At the moment, I'm using my pair of scissors for a hold for my microphone, and I lost my other pair of scissors, so I bought these recently. Now, our first thing is to go and buy the most expensive pair of scissors and then think we've now invested in our sewing journey. The thing is, you need a pair of scissors that's sharp enough, but you don't need the most expensive pair. What I found through the years and in the times where I sewed for my shop, I would actually go through scissors like some people go through toilet paper. And it got to a point where it was not worth sharpening them because it will cost me the same as a mid-range pair of scissors. So get yourself one, not the entry-level ones, like my one friend came with one that she bought at the cheap 5 Rand store. Those ones, they cut okay, but they do slip when you cut, and it will frustrate you from year to eternity. So this one was about, I would say, $10. If you transfer it from, no, it was less, it was $7 from rands into dollars. But I've seen some really nice ones at Hobby Lobby for about, I think it was like $10 or $15. So just look at the ones and find one that is sharp enough and that you will be able to cut with for at least the next year. And then when you really get into sewing and you start working with really thick fabrics, invest in a proper sewing scissors. And you can use those for the thick fabrics. But what I find, I prefer these because they're not heavy. Sometimes the fabric scissors are really heavy and really bulky to sew with, and my hands can't handle it. So with these, I love it because they're easy to cut with, they're sharp, I like this length, it's not too long, and I like it when the point goes up a little bit because then it doesn't get hooked on stuff. So ultimately, find yourself a pair of scissors that can cut, that is sharp, and that's all you need. Now we're getting to some things that we sometimes forget. Every sewing kit needs a tape measure. My tape measure is also somewhere in storage. I haven't found it yet. So I borrowed my friend's, and hers actually came in this little holder, which I think is brilliant because then your tape measure doesn't float all over the show. If you do not find one in a holder like this, just do it like fold it up long and put a little bit of elastic around it so you can put it in your sewing kit or your sewing bag and you know it's there. Another thing that I would advise you to get is your dressmaker's chalk or a marking pen, because when you start sewing, there's pattern markings on your patterns and you need to be able to transfer them. I like chalk, but I find it sometimes it doesn't work so well on some things. So I actually prefer the heat erasable markers because they, as soon as you iron your thing, they just erase whatever mark you've made. And then lastly, get yourself some beeswax. When you do hand sewing, you just pull your needle and thread through the beeswax and your thread will not knot. There is nothing as frustrating as when you're sewing on a button and it just makes this big crow's nest at the bottom. So I find I just bought a beeswax candle and I use that to pull my threads through, and sewing has become so much nicer. And when I travel, I literally fit everything I need in here. Optional things that you can look at is, I think it's called the awl, which you make holes with. I find I use this quite a lot, but it's not necessary. Another thing I have in here is just some extra clippers, because I often lose them, and it's so frustrating. And then a bonus tip that I really cannot live without, I never thought I would need this in my sewing kit, is a measuring gauge. You find these at Hobby Lobby, and I've seen them on Amazon, and it's just so that you can measure, like if you have a half-inch seam or 1.5 seam, so you can actually measure it with the different directions. And I cannot tell you how often I use this little gadget. And that, my friend, is all the things you need to be able to start sewing on a budget. In the next video, we will talk about where you can find fabric on a budget and patterns on a budget. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you've learned something, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.